Thanks, Scott, and good evening, everybody. I want to talk tonight about a topic that I think we talked about once before, but it comes up a lot, and I think there's some misunderstanding around it. And it's a concept we hear a lot about in sex addiction, and CSATs will refer to it, and that's something we call eroticized rage. And I think it's just important to understand kind of what it is and what it isn't, and kind of how it looks, because anybody who's seeing a CSAT will probably come across this term. And I think this, on its initial impact, it sounds like it's something maybe different than what it is. So basically, I want to kind of go over what it is. I want to define it. I want to talk about what it looks like behaviorally, and maybe what's behind it and what's going on with that. So basically, simply put, when someone once described eroticized rage as when anger and sex come together. And of course, when we hear it, we think about kind of violent sex or raging, physically aggressive sex. And, you know, it can be that in terms of the consensual stuff, but by far the most expressive expressions of eroticized rage take many different forms. One of the definition, by the way, a guy named Robert Stoller, who did a lot of early work with arousal templates, and he wasn't necessarily in terms of sex addiction, but sex in general, talked about it's the merge of shame, disapproval, and judgment, all intertwined with sex. And so this is different behaviors. And let me just say what they are first, then we'll talk a little bit about some of the background of it. There's many different ways it can be expressed, so I'm just going to go down the list. One is voyeurism, which is just on that borderline of offending behavior. Many would consider it offending behavior. Voyeurism is intrusively, you know, looking at other people for one's own gratification, often sexual gratification, and it has that kind of creepy factor that goes with it. Watching or touching a person who's sleeping or incapacitated, speaking of creepy, and this is something that does happen where people are either knocked out or asleep or passed out, and someone gets a little bit of a charge out of watching or touching them while they sleep. Using binoculars to watch people. Again, this is kind of a form of voyeurism, but very intrusive, very for one's own purposes, right? One's own thrill. Hiding in secret places to watch or listen to people. There's another word, spying on people, basically. And this can be, sometimes we see this actually in marriages. We had a very famous case where I live here of one of the local sheriff used to watch his wife getting involved with other men. He would be in the closet watching them. That was kind of his particular thrill. Touching people when they are acting like it was an accident. So you're on a bus or a subway or in a mall or anywhere where there's people, and you kind of bump up against them and touch them for sexual gratification, but then pretend, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were there, or something like that. And so we see this oftentimes on crowded transportation buses and so on. Stalking people, right? Just simply monitoring people, going after them, keeping track, using online voyeur websites. So unfortunately, there's many sites like that out there. People have the technology and the wherewithal now to do some of this. Going into another apartment for underwear, going and taking some kind of token that we see, and often we see not very unusual, but relatively common. We see guys who come to treatment and seeking integrity who, over the course of their lifetime, might have done this either as adolescents or as young adults or at some time. We see this, again, a form of eroticized rage coming out. Making inappropriate sexual advances or gestures toward another person. So this is where we see boundaries being crossed in workplace situations, something that really has been drawn to light by this whole Me Too movement that is now some years old, but the consciousness is really important. Also, when we find making inappropriate just sexual comments, bringing sex into sexual jokes or sexual comments, or when it's not appropriate, it has nothing to do with the conversation. It's just it's overly sexualizing some conversation that often you'll notice people are getting uncomfortable, right? Because some boundary has been crossed. Finding sex partners over enough control or power. You know, oftentimes part of the thrill, the dopamine rush and adrenaline rush with sex addiction involves power, control, in extreme cases, domination, but more it's this sort of transactional thing that involves a lot of power and control and manipulation, grooming, and so on. And then other things like revenge sex, a really perverse form of that. And finally, another one is exhibitionism. And exhibitionism, classic exhibitionism, is not just about exhibiting yourself in public, but it's the goal there, the rush for an exhibitionist is the shock, the reaction, the surprise on people's faces. It's like, oh my God, and that's the thrill right there. So these are all different forms of eroticized rage, what we call eroticized rage. And you can see the common threads here are aggression and anger, in some cases overt, in some cases not so overt, more of a passive aggressive kind of thing, all intertwined with sex. Patrick Carnes talked about really the basis of this being really kind of what personality type you are when you encounter some kind of diminishing, or what you perceive of as a diminishing or a traumatic experience, when you've been rejected, or when you've been shamed, or when you've been embarrassed. And he talks about two differences and the way people react. And one kind of person he talks about will be someone who's not a narcissist. And we remember a lot of addicts, and especially sex addicts, have narcissistic trends. But somebody who's not a narcissist, when that would happen, if they're embarrassed or shamed or somehow feel diminished, they might take that in. They might feel rejected. They might feel shame. They might internalize it as shame. The narcissist, however, and by definition, narcissists have a hard time owning or accepting these undesirable parts of themselves. They don't want to see it, and they'll go to great lengths to avoid seeing it or being made aware of it. So they'll force it outward, right? That feeling of what someone might feel as rejection or shame or embarrassment, to a narcissist, if they're diminished like that, might feel outrage or resentful or aggrieved, right? There'd be grievance. And so in a way, it's kind of a rationalization of some of these things. And so the narcissist will experience an intolerable that emotion, and the impulse to escape that emotion is really strong. And that's sex addiction, and really any addiction is all about escaping those intense emotions, right? And then it's projected outward in the form of the sex addiction. There's one other form that this can take, or rather one other source, and that is what we call incest, either covert or overt. Covert incest is where there's a lot of sexualized messages in the home. There's inappropriate kind of boundary crossing. For example, a wife might confide in her son about her sexual issues with her husband. It's just inappropriate stuff like that, or touching, sexualized comments, people walking around the house without clothes on, that kind of thing. That's more overt. But these early life experiences can also lead to this sexualized aggression. So really, bottom line, anything that leaves the child powerless or searching for escape or control can drive the addict into fantasy. And remember, fantasy is the place where addicts, and especially sex and porn addicts, go to find that relief, to step out of their pain, and to kind of disconnect from it and have their own kind of rich inner life in this fantasy world. And those things, all of these can be potential avenues to eroticized rage. When we take a step back, eroticized rage isn't necessarily good or bad. It's obviously, if it takes the form of outright aggression in terms of dominance or BDSM, that kind of thing, then obviously we're looking for consensual partners, right? And obviously, if it crosses the line into offending behavior, that's a problem as well. But in many cases, if people are just expressing a lot of anger or resentment in general, even in their conversation, or in passive aggressive ways, which often happens too, that's a real issue for the relationship then to look at, and for the CSAT and the couples therapist to take that on and to really look and see what's going on here, what's really going on here. And as we know, with any kind of addiction, we have to kind of open the hood and kind of dig in there and see what's really going on underneath. What purpose is this serving for the addict? And until we can really get to the roots of some of that, and I talked about some of these historical causes for eroticized rage, the behavior, or at least the impulse for the behavior, will continue. So we really have to kind of do some digging in there. This takes time. It takes patience. These are old patterns that are what we call deeply grooved, meaning they're habits, they're habitual. People fall into these without even trying or being conscious of it. And so it takes a lot of work and patience. And so, again, what therapists can do is work if it's really a dysfunctional pattern in the relationship. If it's offending, there's avenues, or if it's just helping the person accept that they may have a certain kind of kinky sexual attraction that isn't hurting anyone, or if it requires consent. But a therapist can deal with what we call ego dystonic attractions, meaning I, as the person having it, I'm really disturbed by this. I don't want to have it. You know, we can't take fetishes or kinks away, but we can help someone deal with it and come to terms with it, if you will. And so with that, I think I'm going to stop my talk and we'll carry on. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. We've got some questions in the Q&A already, but I got a couple of quick ones. You mentioned that, you know, this eroticized rage comes from personality type, from narcissism, from covert/overt incest. Do other forms of sexual trauma also lead to this, or will other forms of sexual trauma play into this?
I think if there's trauma in general, and I don't think it even has to be sexual trauma. I think trauma is the in any form is the kind that really puts people at high risk for this kind of behavior, and for addiction for that matter. But yeah, I think trauma in any way, it's that sense of being diminished or reduced or somehow feeling less than. It's a very kind of primitive psychological defense to kind of empower oneself, but it takes the form in an unhealthy way. But yeah, I think trauma certainly can be a potential pathway to this, any kind of trauma.
Yeah. So empowering oneself leads to my next question, which is, you mentioned power control in the sexual setting. And specifically, I thought BDSM, which you then addressed, but do people with eroticized rage, are they typically the S, or are they sometimes the M, or does it vary by person? You know, are we the flogger or the floggee with eroticized rage, basically?
You know, it can take both forms, but more typically, I guess the person with eroticized rage would be the flogger, because it gets expressed outwardly. I can remember cases though where people kind of internalize that back and feel a need to be punished somehow. But that's when we think of classic eroticized rage, it's not so much what's turned back against oneself, but more directed outward. I will say too, the power and control can be more subtle than just kind of BDSM, which is so right out there, right? Power and control can be manipulation in subtle ways. It can be finding affair partners who are, you know, young, vulnerable women who have no money. You know, I've had bankers and Wall Street traders who would get involved with young women and be over whom they could have some control. And they would look at it as a helpful kind of a project. You know, they'd sometimes pay tuition or pay rent and often can't see the harm that's doing, but it's really locking that young woman into a certain place. And it really takes the form of eroticized rage because there's a lot of control issues that ugliness can appear sometimes when the relationship goes south.
And not only do they not see the harm they're doing, they often think of themselves as a nice, benevolent guy. Right. Well, I'm paying her rent. So, you know, I'm putting her through school. Is she really going to school? I don't know. You know, right. Like, okay, let's call this what it is. You're paying for sex. I have a couple more questions. One of them I already saw in the Q&A, so I'll hold off on that one. But well, actually, let's just jump to the Q&A.
Okay.
And I may ask another question later. So I'm actually going to, this is the question that I had as well. So the question is written, does this behavior apply to fantasy? And my version of the question was, if I'm fantasizing about this stuff, what are the odds I'm going to take it into the real world? So kind of the same question.
Right, that's a really great question. And it's one that a lot of people, obviously, if somebody has some of these darker fantasies, it can be worrisome, right? And does that spill over into the real world? Research shows that for the far great majority of people, it does not. Fantasy is fantasy. When we start adding certain drugs to it, like methamphetamine and cocaine and things that kind of alter judgment and impulse control, we do start seeing more of this kind of being enacted. But I think a lot of us, if we're honest, probably have some darker fantasies in our heads, and very rarely do those ever get acted on. And so this is a worrisome thing, and for a lot of people, because they see themselves, and this is a common, as you know, with tolerance from the dopamine and the adrenaline and the escalation that occurs, people get into some really extreme stuff, and it can be behavioral. But if those really kind of aggressive fantasies are in the head, very, very rarely does that spill over. And when they do, there's probably been a long-standing pattern of offending behavior, and more, I think it's not so much a matter of addiction, but offending. And those are two very different things. You're muted.
Muted myself. I was going to add, like just in the child pornography realm, there's quite a bit of research on whether it's going to carry over into the real world or not from looking at pornography. And the biggest risk factor for that is a history of other criminal behavior.
Right. Exactly.
That's the risk factor, is like, have you been arrested for forging checks and breaking into people's homes? Then you're at risk to carry it into the real world. Most people will not. But let me ask you this one sort of semi-related question. In my experience, and I do teach our porn addiction work groups, a lot of the guys will carry this eroticized rage into their porn viewing, even though it's never going to seep into their real world. Do you see that? What does that mean? You know?
Yeah. So our arousal templates and our erotic fantasies and what sex therapists call our scripts, these kind of patterns in our heads, really are incredibly complex and almost always, if not always, reflect some of our psychological concerns and issues and fears. And there's been some really great research on how sexual fantasies allow us to be sexual in the face of feeling unworthy and unlovable and unsafe and all that, right? It allows sex to finally be expressed despite all these psychological barriers that we have inside our heads. And so we see the fantasies kind of taking place in that realm. So they're quite common. Where addiction has an impact is that because of tolerance, we just need more of a dopamine kick. We need more shocking content to get that same level of arousal that we had from something else. And so we see this kind of natural evolution and escalation of the kind of pornography that people are looking at. And I think the unfortunate thing, like in states like California, and I think Pennsylvania have laws where therapists are required to report someone if they tell us in the course of therapy they've been looking at underage pornography. I understand the intent of that to protect, but it really misunderstands the nature of addiction versus offending. Most sex addicts may escalate into that undoubtedly questionable, area. We don't want to go there. That's never good in any circumstances. But it's not necessarily that these people are going to go out and become child predators. They're not, based on the research, all the research we have, unless they have that history of offending behavior and so on. So all this stuff takes place really in the realm of fantasy, and that's really kind of where almost all of it is.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. All right. Will a sex addict always display some of the, I'm going to change this from addictive behavior to addictive thinking that they've used, such as minimizing, rationalizing, blaming, that kind of stuff, denial. So will a sex addict always display some of those tendencies toward denial?
Right. So, I mean, yes. The short answer is yes. One of the hallmarks of addiction is denial, and kind of being out of touch and unaware and not wanting to see the reality of the situation. But sex addicts, like almost everybody else, incorporate what we call these cognitive errors, which is a thinking problem, a thinking issue. We've actually had webinars on that topic here. But things like, rationalizing, minimizing, jumping to conclusions, black and white thinking, these are all kind of shortcuts in our thinking that can kind of lead us to the wrong conclusion about things. And so it's very common for sex addicts to do that. In my experience, some of them will sort of start to correct but the way they get corrected is by pointing them out, by becoming aware of them, and then consciously trying to change them. And so this is going to require involvement with people where you can get feedback, where other people can basically serve as a mirror to you. So it may be a sponsor, maybe your peers in program, it may be people that trust you and you trust to give you that feedback. But until it's pointed out, these things are really hard to see. That we automatically put ourselves into a corner, but with black and white thinking, or we constantly minimize things, or all that stuff won't necessarily change on its own. It needs to be, people need to be made aware of it, and then we have to actively try to work at replacing those habits, thinking habits, with healthier ones.
And one of the hallmarks of addiction is we engage in this sort of stinking thinking, the denial. The way I explain denial is, if David was engaging in the same behaviors as me, David would have a real problem. David would be crazy. David would need help. But it's okay for me because ... Just fill in the blank. And I can think back to 23 years ago. I went to treatment for this addiction, and I was deep in denial. And the therapist there said, write down all the reasons that your behavior is okay. Write down why what you're doing is okay. And I wrote about 3 single-space pages, and it took me about 3 minutes. I mean, I had a bunch of ready reasons, and the next day in group, she had me read those aloud to the group. And I got to somewhere between item maybe 5 and 10 on a list of 80 or 90. And I just was like, oh my God, I'm crazy. Because all of a sudden I heard the crazy coming out of my mouth. I could hear it coming from you,
right?
But to me, it made perfect sense, because I wanted it to make sense. And it was only when I had to say it out loud in a room full of people who are like, it's like, oh man. So there is something about, and we have exercises that we do both with the guys at Sila and in our work groups that work on identifying and breaking down denial. And it's, I think it personally a really fun class to teach, because the guys, things come out of their mouth and I'm like, did you just hear that? And they'll be like, oh, wow. That's crazy. It's like, yep, sure is. But we don't hear it until we hear it.
It's really about, you're exactly right. It's really important. If it's in our head, kind of in the comfort of our distorted thinking, it all makes sense, right? But when we put it out into the universe and we hear ourselves or people point it out, then it's so clear. But that's an important process. You're right.
Yeah.
We can't. So again, that's one of the really critical things about recovery, right? We can't do it on our own. We can't read a book and draw this conclusion. We need the interaction and the feedback from other people. That's the only way it works. And we continue to do that in recovery.
Yeah, and a lot of people think when they hear the word denial that denial is what comes out of my mouth. That I don't really believe it, but I'm expecting you to believe it. And the trick with denial is I have to believe it first, and then it will come out of my mouth. So I'm really good at lying to myself, and I'm also really good at keeping secrets from myself. I've never done that. But in point of fact, I've done it. I've done it 100 times. I just shove it in a box and slam the lid and lock the box and stow it in the back closet of my brain because it's too shameful for me. Right. And I think with eroticized rage, a lot of times, and I think you see this with guys who come into treatment, they're not even aware that they've actually done. I mean, this list that you've got, they're not even really aware they've done it until, they take the SDI, which is a big inventory that we do with them, or do the intake where we ask them specifically about things, and then they'll be like, no, oh wait, you get a lot of those answers.
Exactly.
So yeah. Okay, let's move on here. This is right up your alley, David. What are the effects of poppers on mental and physical health? Maybe you can explain what poppers are and how they're taken and why they're taken, and then yeah.
So poppers are a drug, amyl nitrates and butyl nitrates, the nitrates. They are an old cardiac medication. They got the name poppers because when people were feeling congested, kind of like angina, they would pop the top off this little vial and inhale. And it's these fumes that go right up into your nose. There's a liquid in the bottle, but you inhale the fumes. And it's what it does is instantly kind of blow out every smooth vessel in your body. And so it's described as a head rush. It's a very central thing. People often do it right at the time of orgasm to kind of enhance the experience. It also makes anal sex more comfortable. So you see a lot of gay guys using this because of the smoothing out all the muscles. Everything's sort of easier to do. But because of that smoothing out of the muscles, it also does a couple other things that may not be so wonderful. It drops your blood pressure. So your blood pressure will tank. And that's one thing to know about. And the problem is if you're taking poppers, as many people do with an erectile dysfunction drug like Viagra or Cialis, those also drop your blood pressure. And so you can really get into kind of a bad situation with a very, very low blood pressure with poppers. And so for some, whatever reason, a lot of guys consider these they don't count in their sobriety. And I always try to correct that misconception because these are powerful drugs. I was mentioning at another group last night, there's a longitudinal study of HIV and the drug and behaviors that lead to someone becoming HIV positive. And of the drugs, the first and most dangerous, and this is not a surprise to anybody, was methamphetamine. The second one was poppers. In terms of the power and the frequency that drug shows up with people that turn out to become that acquire the HIV virus. So it's a dangerous drug. It's a difficult drug. People can actually have some cardiac damage if they overdo it. And so, yeah, it's a tricky business. It's illegal. It's sold in head shops under the guise of other kinds of things. And the more it kind of is unregulated, I think the more dangerous it can get. Now there's another version that is not, well, it's been around forever, but it's more popular now, the ethyl chloride, which is a little bit different than the amyl nitrates and more toxic, actually. I mentioned this to a group last night. In my day, this is a long time ago, people used to put ethyl chloride on hankies and inhale it, on the dance floor and stuff. Now you can get it in a little bottle, but it can actually cause some certain kinds of brain damage. So it's a tricky business.
Yeah. What are for sex addicts in recovery, we talk about, smoking will slow down the healing process. Just neurochemically, do poppers have kind of the same effect? Because I know when people do poppers, they don't typically do one sniff. They're going all night. Right.
I think the danger, there's two. There's kind of a longer term danger with the brain and poppers, but I think the immediate danger is in just the blood pressure issue and the kind of headspace it gets people into, and it contributes to it just heightens that arousal and the kind of the insatiability of that moment, I think, for people, which is very dangerous, right? It just leads to more reckless behavior and more dangerous behavior. So yeah, I mean, does it slow down recovery? Absolutely. And is it harmful? Yeah, absolutely. These are not benign drugs, although they've been around so long and they're popular, but so have cigarettes, right? And not so safe. So same thing.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, next one here. Type some questions in for us. We've got a couple here, but we'll need some more by the end. I'm a betrayed partner. Discovery was 8 months ago. I discovered that the addict was watching TV shows that have lots of sexual content and pretty women and not a lot of clothing. He's a sex, love, porn, and fantasy addict. I got triggered with this discovery, and he said he doesn't get triggered. He also hid that he was watching this from me. Okay, we'll come back to that statement. Then he asked if I was supposed to know everything that he watches on TV. My answer is yes. I'm so angry and hurt that he is still lying by omission and hiding things from me. How do we move forward? All yours, David.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. And first of all, I just want to validate your feelings for being, angry and upset, because these kind of behaviors, and we've talked about this on this webinar before, we see blaming, lack of responsibility, half steps. These are all kind of bad warning signs. So I want to talk a little bit about not porn, which we've also talked about here before, but it's worthy of a review. A lot of guys will not look at explicit, like X-rated pornography, but they'll look at other things that we call in this big kind of classification, not porn. What's not porn? That's Facebook, Instagram, certain TV shows. Scott's referred to Game of Thrones before, right? A lot of clothing and violence, or lack of clothing rather, and violence. And these are the kind of shows that are titillating, right? And they do provide a dopamine rush. And whether someone is aware of it or not, and I kind of have a hard time believing they're not aware of it, especially if they're keeping a secret about it, these people are getting high. We do not have to have explicit vision images in front of us to sort of play a porno tape in our mind. We have fantasy, and we have powerful brains that can take an image from a clothing catalog or a TV show or Facebook and run with it. And so these are something, we have to really cast a broader scope in terms of what we have to be aware of as recovering sex addicts, what we're looking at, what we're filling our eyes and our heads with, because these are just other ways of getting that same dopamine. We spoke a few minutes ago about denial. Here's a case of denial or just outright manipulation, not owning the behavior, not taking responsibility, because these are real serious issues that people have to face, because this is a slippery slope, right? This will lead to a full-blown relapse, and I would say it is a relapse. Frankly, it's a slip, and it's nothing else, because you're purposely pulling the levers of your brain to get that dopamine rush that you would get from porn, just in a different format. We don't need the porn to get that high. So how do you move forward? I think I don't know if you say your husband is in treatment or not, or seeing a CSAT. It's really important that he is going to meetings and getting a CSAT, because he needs kind of some reality checks from peers and the therapist. It's probably not going to be very effective coming from you right now. Sad to say. You certainly have a right to express your feelings, but he needs to hear it and get a kick in the butt, frankly, from some people who are going to kind of call him out on the behavior, because it's a little bit of game playing. The fact that he's keeping it secret tells me that he's aware this isn't so cool and okay. So I think that's something to really look at. Now, in terms of how you can move forward, I think hopefully you're getting the support you need, so you have the support in terms of what you need to do. I think what you need to do is talk about boundaries and creating some boundaries of what is going to be acceptable for you to feel safe, so that you're not continuing to feel upset and betrayed and all of that. And so it's moving forward is going to take him to clean up his program and really start to take it seriously, because right now there's a lot of leaks in that recovery program that are ultimately going to sink the ship, I believe, unless they're corrected. But now, are you dependent on that? You can do your own boundaries, you can protect yourself and figure out what you need to do. And it may be saying, I need you to move out for 3 months until you can, so I can feel safe until you get this under control, something that's up to you and your therapist to work out. But yeah, I think action needs to be taken. You're muted, Scott.
This is a general rule for all the addicts listening. If you're keeping it secret, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Because why are you keeping it secret? If you're watching Baywatch, but only when your wife's not home, well, why don't you watch it when she's home too? Oh, she might be, this might be a triggering thing for you and her. And I don't know, addicts who watch these shows and say they don't get triggered. I mean, I'm 20 years sober from this addiction, and I still sometimes have to change the channel because it's too much. David mentioned Game of Thrones. I just don't watch it. Lying by omission, keeping secrets. If you want to heal your relationship, rigorous honesty is needed, and that means everything all the time. If your wife would want to know, you have to tell, and tell the whole truth and tell it before she asks. That's how you heal a relationship. And as David mentioned, we don't know if the addict here is in recovery or not. If he's not, obviously, get a CSAT, come to some more groups. If he's in recovery and still doing this, it's probably time to up the game after 8 months, and that may include, all the way up to residential treatment. I mean, this is a point where if you've been in recovery and you're still not getting it, you got to up the game. Otherwise, you're never going to get it. So, anyway, thoughts. I'm not sure what this question refers to, but it says, what about chat rooms? So, David, tell us what chat rooms are and why they can be part of addiction, why they're so triggering,
Right. So chat rooms obviously are where we can interact with people, often that we pay for the privilege of interacting with. Sometimes not. Sometimes they're just other people looking to hook up, looking to talk, looking for sexual conversation. And what we know about addiction, and Dr. Rob always talks about sex addicts as having an intimacy disorder of sorts. We know, and this is a general rule just from even social media, it's easier to talk to a stranger, even about erotic things, more than you would talk to someone that you really care about and have an emotional, like your wife or husband. And so these chat rooms are popular because they're a fantasy space. They're a fantasy space where you can kind of interact with someone who is part of your fantasy and will play along with it for pay. And they're dangerous in that they can lead to the actual escalation of behavior, but they're dangerous in that they also represent a relapse. We have a lot of guys that come in, again, target denial, saying, well, I never actually hooked up with a person. I never actually met with somebody. It's only online. What's the harm? The harm is that it's a betrayal, just as much as an in-person betrayal. And ask any spouse how they feel about it, because it's bring someone into your life in a very very close and intimate way, who's a stranger and is strictly for fantasy and for sexual gratification. And so that's the problem with chat rooms. Remember, a lot of sex and porn addicts live, fantasy is the main currency of the addiction. And a lot of guys, and especially we have a lot of people with various religious traditions who come through treatment who don't act out sexually with anybody else, but they have a whole rich fantasy life of people with people online. And that's just as much of a sex addiction and betrayal as anything else. So chat rooms, chat rooms are in my mind, right up there with the category of not porn or any other kind of a place that we shouldn't be. That people have no business being in a chat room, in my opinion.
Yeah, I consider chat rooms a form of not porn. Technically, it's not porn, but we use it like it's porn. We get titillated, we masturbate, we have fantasies, we can do the whole relationship thing in our head, without ever being in the same room as somebody. And the whole purpose of the addiction is to escape from emotional discomfort. I can do that with porn. I can do it with not porn. I can do it with alcohol. I can do it with drugs. I can do it with a chat room. And sex and porn addiction are fantasy addictions. And some of my porn addicts look at hardcore porn. Some of them look at softcore porn because it leaves more to the imagination. Some of them prefer not porn because it leaves even more to the imagination. And some of them prefer what we call erotica, which is written porn or chat rooms, because it leaves everything to the imagination. I can remember, this is sort of embarrassing, but when I watched pornography, I used to turn the sound down because I didn't want them to have a weird voice or say anything that was going to ruin my fantasy. So I turned the sound off. And that's actually, I find, very common with the porn addicts I talk to. So,
right, for sure. And it's a bad place to be because it just feeds that fantasy piece so thoroughly. And I would say there's one other thing that I've seen sometimes with guys who will have a little bit of a romance addiction kind of thing going on, which almost by definition is being the limerence state, the oxytocin that we we experience when we first fall in love with somebody. That's a real rush and a high of sorts, and that's the kind of the chemical component of love and romance addiction. But we can see it a little bit with guys getting involved, emotionally, in air quotes, with these fantasy women on chat spaces like that. And so it's a different kind of rush. And and again, I've had clients classify that as somehow different and more okay than sexual acting out. No, even an emotional thing is still a betrayal as well, right? So these are all kind of ways that people play a little bit of a game, I think, to make it, like Scott was saying, all the reasons this is okay for me. And we can twist and like a pretzel to kind of make it try to fit, and it doesn't.
Yeah. Okay, next one here. Speaking of smoking slowing down the recovery and healing process, does any form of tobacco in any quantity slow things down? This is something we often have to deal with at our treatment center because it's a no smoking facility. And the guys say, well, vaping isn't smoking. And we say, no, vaping is smoking. It's just a different form. So chewing tobacco, vaping, all of that stuff, is it the same as smoking and with the same issues?
Yes, bottom line, yes. We're dealing with, tobacco, right, as a drug, and tobacco is a carrier of nicotine, which is the active element that we're really going for. And remember, nicotine gives us more dopamine than an orgasm. That's a really powerful hit, and which is why I think those of us who have quit smoking and have a hard time with it can attest, yeah, it's a powerful hit and it's hard to give up. But like any drug, we can ingest it in different ways, right? We can smoke it, we can put it in our lip, we can vape it. So there's different ways of introducing the drug into our system. The drug is still the drug. In some ways it'll hit our bloodstream faster, in other ways it takes a little bit longer, but it's all still the same thing. And why are we concerned about nicotine anyway? And so the problem with nicotine is, as I said, it's a powerful drug, more powerful than an orgasm. But what we find is that it's a little bit of a devious drug as well, because it goes right to the part of the brain, the midbrain, where addiction lives, basically. And it keeps that part of the brain in idle. It kind of does a double hit on the molecule. Just neurochemically, it's a little bit more complicated in terms of how it's metabolized. But what that ends up meaning is that the brain kind of never totally dries out from the addiction. And so we can have people give figures. Can you still hear me, Scott?
No, you're going in and out. Now you're reverberating.
I don't know why my microphone just changed on me. Is that better?
You're back. You're back.
I don't know what happened. But so it keeps the brain kind of in idle. And I think it's a disservice. A lot of treatment centers, I used to work in one where people continue to smoke, and boy, it was a locked facility. It was a psych unit, so people would run down to the cage. And I still remember the sight of all these cigarette smokers kind of getting on their cigarette break and desperate to be in the cage. So it's a disservice. So consequently, we are a non-smoking program. We'll help you get off in terms of patches or whatever, but we really strongly believe that nicotine needs to go, and to help somebody really move into recovery.
Yeah. Okay. Have you heard much about the use of psychedelics for treatment of both the sex addict and the partner? I feel kind of hopeless for myself and my sex addict partner. So this is from the betrayed partner. We've been doing this, I assume that's recovery, for a few years with very slow progress. So the use of psychedelics as a form of addiction treatment. I'm going to just shut up.
Maybe you should meet yourself, Scott. Yeah, so it is very popular, and I don't mean to dismiss it, because there's really finally, for the first time in probably 30 years, we're doing some good research now on how drugs that have been basically banned and thought of as non-medically valuable, how they might be valuable, but not so much for things like addiction, but more for things like trauma. And so there are things like ketamine, we found, is a really strong antidepressant in certain circumstances. It can help where no other medication will if somebody's severely depressed, suicidally depressed. Ketamine has been shown to have some help. Ecstasy, MDMA has been shown to help certain trauma people. And this is done in microdoses, meaning there's small doses given over time in the context of a therapeutic session that's kind of guided. And so it opens up the brain, it drops some of the resistance, and it gives the therapist the opportunity to conduct some of the trauma work in a safe way, emotionally safe way for the person. So yeah, there's a lot of now interest, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of certifications in California. A therapist can be certified in some of these things now. So it's out there. I think we have to be really careful, those of us in the addiction world, and I'm speaking now as a recovering addict myself, because, oh, that sounds so appealing, whether it's mushrooms or MDMA or ecstasy or other things. I think the risk is quite high because although it's not the mood changing effect per se, I think it's a reliance on this outside chemical. And I just think, I don't know, I'm still very much in the wait and see category for addiction. That said, I don't know of any protocols per se that deal with sex and porn addiction with the use of microdosing of any kind of these chemicals. It's not just considered acceptable treatment right now. So we'll see what happens. Things are moving very fast in that arena, but I think we need to be really careful. There are a lot of drugs out there, legal and not. Things like ibogaine. There's a certain drugs from the Amazon that are used that are hallucinogenic that people can go and have these kind of weekend experiences led by shaman. I've had clients go over the years, often not with great results. Sometimes they seem to think it was helpful for a while, then it wasn't. So there's a lot of stuff out there. I think if I were an addict right now, seeking treatment, seeking help, I'd be very conservative about this kind of stuff because we just don't exactly know the impact yet on the brain. So, yeah.
David's in the wait and see camp. I'm in the absolutely not camp. I've seen a couple people go through these trials, and the side effects are any progress they made and whatever they were trying to deal with, the side effects were horrendous, not for them, but for the people around them. I am an absolute no on this personally. So, okay, now I'm going to shut up. David is much more scientific about this than I am.
And I'm coming as a trauma therapist, right? I've seen, the research on trauma and but none of that has anything to do with addiction. And so I think when you get the mind of an addict in there, it's tricky. It's really tricky.
Yeah. Okay, I'm a sex and porn addict and I've been doing recovery work for 1 year. I've stayed away from porn, fantasy, and objectification. Congratulations. I'm separated from my partner for about a year. I have not been able to achieve abstinence from masturbation, which occurs 3 to 10 times per month. There are times that I touch my own body because I miss my partner's touch. Is this normal or addict behavior? David, go ahead. I have thoughts on this too, but go ahead.
Yeah, so, I think we talked earlier tonight about how sex and porn addiction really is a way to avoid feelings, and it's a way to sort of self-soothe. And I think a lot of guys, a lot of women too, frankly, I think look at masturbation as a way to soothe themselves, to relieve stress and discomfort, and in certain situations that's perfectly fine. I think in early recovery, or when that's part of one's recovery plan, that kind of setting an intention not to masturbate and then doing it with such frequency is troublesome, right? And I think it really goes to probably some uncomfortable feeling, uncomfortable stress, discomfort. I think what masturbation, in this case, it's really not about sex, although there's some thoughts about touch, according to the question. But fantasy really, or rather masturbation, is really a way to soothe and escape. And I think this is kind of keeping your recovery from becoming a real full-blown thing, because I think you're still kind of, that's an outlet. It's a back door that's kind of a leak on your recovery of the energy in your recovery. So I'd really, if you have a CSAT, I would really take this to that person and start looking at, because you're doing some good work in recovery. You're putting in the time, you're taking the effort, but there's something here. And I think there's a lot of different reasons that I can think of why that might be there. So it's probably best done in the context of your relationship with your therapist to see what you can do. But I think this is definitely something to look at and to try to get under control, because this is not okay. This is going to keep you from progressing in your recovery overall, despite your good efforts. So that's my quick thought. Scott, how about you?
Yeah, you nailed it. I mean, the only thing I would add is, I would challenge you to not masturbate for 30 days and see what that's like for you. Just try to go 30 days, like really buckle down and try to go for 30 days and see what that's like for you. Because you will start to realize, oh, I want to masturbate now. It's because I'm feeling lonely or bored. There are better ways to overcome loneliness and boredom than masturbation. As a matter of fact, masturbation doesn't solve anything. It just gets you out of those feelings for, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it is. It doesn't actually fix anything. So if you're not masturbating for 30 days or 60 or 90, it kind of forces you to go to healthier coping mechanisms, which I think is a really good idea. But congratulations on staying away from the other stuff. I mean, that's awesome. Pat yourself on the back for that.
For sure.
I think it's a follow-up. Are psychedelics non-addictive? I understand opiates and stimulants can be.
Great question, actually. Yeah, you're right. Opiates, stimulants, and a whole bunch of other drugs can be addictive. In general, weirdly,
I think they're saying, I understand opiates and stimulants can be non-addictive. I think that's what they were saying.
Oh, okay. That was so far from my universe, I didn't even read it that way. Okay. Yeah, so let me say categorically, opiates and amphetamines and a whole bunch of other drugs are totally addictive. Alcohol, you name it, there's a whole bunch of drugs that are addictive and inherent in their very nature. And so now addiction, of course, nature, nurture, there's a lot of other factors that go into the development of addiction, the genetic risk, but those drugs are definitely addictive. When it comes to hallucinogens, it's a little bit interesting because all the other drugs that we speak of as addictive work in what's called the midbrain on the dopamine circuitry, and it's a whole different kind of chemical thing than hallucinogens, which work more on the neocortex. They're up in the top part of the brain. They work almost always with fantasy and other kinds of perceptual things. And consequently, they've been thought of as traditionally as non-addictive in the sense that they are different in the mechanism of action in the brain than all these other drugs. And the experiences are considered sort of just not addictive in that sense. I think, though, if we talk about addiction as the escape from feelings, it's another way of managing feelings that are uncomfortable. I think I've certainly seen people do that, use different hallucinogens and psychedelics to escape their reality. And the urge to escape can become addictive, even if the drug works on a different part of the brain than the classic addiction circuitry of the brain. But I think it's just tricky, but just to correct any misconception, stimulants, opioids, alcohol, sedatives, things like benzodiazepines, Klonopin, Xanax. I mean, all those are highly addictive and will cause great harm if it gets out of control.
And I've got to be perfectly honest. When I see a question like, are psychedelics non-addictive? My first thought is, oh, somebody wants to drop acid and they're looking for me to sign off on it. And the answer is, no, we're not going to sign off on that.
Right.
If you think that psychedelics can't be harmful, look up, Google the name Syd Barrett, S-Y-D Barrett, B-A-R-R-E-T-T. The first kind of the founder of the rock group Pink Floyd. See what happened to him. It's not pretty. Psychedelics are they're powerful drugs.
Right.
So I have one question that I was kind of sitting on it. We got through all these. So we talked about eroticized rage. I want to know, is there such a thing as eroticized shame? Or are they the same things? I don't know. I'm just curious. It popped into my head when you were speaking at the very beginning.
That's a great question. And I think, any strong emotion has the potential to kind of merge with erotic energy, right? So there's a possibility of something like eroticized rage. What I think, though, in reality is that eroticized shame becomes eroticized rage, because that shame it contributes to that feeling of being diminished, being less than, being somehow aggrieved. And so the shame kind of gets routed into the same kind of eroticized rage that anything else is. But I think, yeah, we have the potential to eroticize anything, including things you wouldn't think of as normally sexual, for sure. Yeah, but shame is a key component.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. We are out of questions. We are out of time. So great topic today. I love the topic of eroticized rage, and great questions to go with it.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. I see one question just popped in. Let's do this real quick. Can you also talk how to safe from about research chemicals? Like, can you
3-MMC, yeah.
I don't know what this is asking. Analogs are
so we're seeing a whole bunch of drugs now called novel psychoactive substances, NPS, and these are basically chemical things with chemical names that are produced in labs, people's basement labs or labs in North Korea and the People's Republic of China and elsewhere, and they're shipped around the globe by internet. People are taking these drugs. Europe is a ground zero for that right now, and so they're very, very dangerous. I just think the people I've talked to that take them, part of the risk and the appeal is the thrill of putting something in your body you don't know what it is and what it's going to do to you. I mean, that's kind of the addictive rush of that. So yeah, some of them can absolutely be addictive.
Yeah, the cure for addiction is connection, healthy connection with other people. The cure for addiction is not more drugs. It's just
right.
That's not going to fix it.
That's never going to work.
Look, I mean, antidepressants and things, people do benefit, but these are heavily researched, long histories, proven effective. They're not really, even though they're psychoactive, they don't get high. I mean, all the drugs you're asking about here get you high. I mean, these are recreational drugs that are used recreationally. That is not the way to fix an addiction. The way to fix an addiction is to look at your underlying issues, process them, do the work, do the trauma work, connect with other people, learn how to be vulnerable in healthy ways. Everything you're asking about is about how can I continue disconnecting and justify it? It doesn't make sense to me. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm getting on a horse here and orating, but you're not going to fix your addiction with a pill. It's not
the bottom line,
to happen.
When we look outside of ourselves for a solution, whether it's a behavior or a chemical, that's a problem, right? That has to come from inside and our connection with other people, but not a thing from outside us. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for letting me rant.
Take a breath, Scott. It's okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. And I appreciate you asking those questions because, I think people need to hear the answer that, there is a solution to addiction, but it's not pills or drugs. So anything you want to say to take us out, Dave?
No, I think I'm done. Great questions tonight.
Have a good night, everybody. We'll be back next week.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks.
Good night.